The U.S. and Iran have had a turbulent relationship since the 1970s, but the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action signed in 2015, commonly known as the Iran nuclear deal, promised to usher in a new era. The U.S. and its allies charged that Iran was trying to acquire the technology used to make nuclear weapons. Though Iran has long maintained that its nuclear ambitions are peaceful, it has developed nuclear technology that could, in time, be put to military use. How has nuclear diplomacy influenced relations between Washington and Tehran? And what are the prospects for the agreement now that the United States has withdrawn from the deal? The Iran deal. Next on Great Decisions.
Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.
It was a revolutionary act that would alter the course of history. Iranian students seized control of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran amid the anti-Western fervor that swept the country in the 1979 Islamic Revolution. 52 American diplomats were held hostage for 444 days, creating an unprecedented crisis.
The Iranian Revolution was as much about shedding foreign influence as it was getting rid of the monarchy.
For many Iranians, it goes back at least until 1953, when the CIA and Britain's MI6 joined forces to overthrow a democratically elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh.
Before the Islamic Revolution, the U.S. had supported the Iranian Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. In the early 1970s, the Shah began work to bring nuclear energy to Iran with the construction of nuclear power plants and the development of a full nuclear cycle.
The Shah's justification was that Iran was going to become a major global industrial power, and it needed electricity. It should rely on nuclear capability.
It was the US which laid the foundation of the Iranian nuclear program. In 1950s and 1960s, practically United States of America proposed Iran to have full nuclear cycle.
The Islamic Revolution isolated Iran from the Western world, with the U.S. and a host of other nations cutting diplomatic ties.
They have their own historical narrative, which has been very much a huge stumbling block to the United States ever really reconciling with Iran, because the historical narratives are so different.
Iran's status as a pariah state deepened in 1984 when Washington imposed sanctions, accusing Iran of state-sponsored terrorism. As it squared off with the West, Iran found itself at war with Iraq. The bloody conflict lasted nearly a decade, costing 500,000 lives. Conventional arms proved ineffective at defending the nation.
It was 8 years of almost hand-to-hand combat, particularly in the southern border regions, where thousands would die to gain hundreds of yards. It was like trench warfare in World War I.
Iran's military strategists became interested in finding weapons of mass destruction deterrents that would compensate for their conventional military weakness.
Iran turned to illicit means to acquire nuclear technology. In 1987, rogue Pakistani scientist Abdul Qadir Khan provided officials with schematics for building a centrifuge which could be used for enriching weapons-grade uranium.
Abdul Qadir Khan, known to the world today as A.Q. Khan, had actually been studying and working in Europe in civilian facilities that were part of the European nuclear industry that use centrifuges to make enriched uranium for nuclear power plants.
In public, Iran no longer kept its nuclear ambitions a secret. It was President George W. Bush who turned up American rhetoric against Iran. President Bush labeled Iran a member of the axis of evil.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil.
Alongside Iraq and North Korea, whose ambitions for weapons of mass destruction had to be countered.
George W. Bush viewed Iran as a major problem that the previous administrations had not taken care of, an ideological regime that was the relic of the past. And that now that the Soviet Union had collapsed and Eastern Europe was gone, it really was time for this other ideological problem to also go away.
Tensions between Iran and the West, led by the U.S., slowly began to escalate. In 2003, the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA, adopted a resolution demanding that Iran suspend all nuclear enrichment and related activity. Iran would also have to allow IAEA inspectors into any location they chose. Iran failed to comply.
و حتی از مفاد پروتکل الحاقی
We believe there is more to this resolution than meets the eye at the first glance. There is an agenda behind it that is conceived in escalating tension and chaos, to divert attention from serious issues that deal with partisan politics in the United States.
A year later, Iran signed the Paris Agreement with the IAEA, France, Germany, and the UK. Tehran agreed to suspend enrichment activities for the duration of the talks. The Paris Agreement bought Iran some time. Instead of referring Iran to the UN Security Council, the international community chose to take Iran at its word.
The suspension of uranium enrichment will continue as long as negotiations are running according to the Paris Agreement.
Paris Agreement was for 3 months working groups to provide solution. I was member of nuclear team that time. I was nuclear spokesperson of the team. We were asking them, okay, give us objective guarantees you want. They didn't have anything. And at the end, they came and they told us, look, we cannot agree with your enrichment, even under NPT, even under international rules and regulations, because of the US objection. That's why everything failed.
In 2005, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, a fiery conservative, came to power as president of Iran. Within days, Iran began to produce uranium hexafluoride, the compound used in the process of enriching reactor and weapons-grade uranium, at its top nuclear facility in Isfahan. The Paris Agreement was now rendered moot. The IAEA referred Iran to the UN Security Council.
Ahmadinejad is a period in which Iran sort of transformed itself as a distant nuclear aspirant to a serious nuclear contender.
In 2006, the US, China, Russia, France, the UK, and Germany banded together to offer Iran incentives in exchange for its agreement to stop its uranium enrichment program. Called the P5+1, the group represents the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council plus Germany. Approved by the UN Security Council, the IAEA's demand that Iran halt its nuclear activities was now legally binding. When Tehran rejected the resolution, the UN imposed sanctions. It became illegal for any country to transfer nuclear or missile-related technology to Iran.
The sanctions were drastic because they were not just US sanctions, they were UN sanctions. And the notion was that if basically Iran is not able to sell much oil, its revenue is limited and it can't buy a lot of materials, even medicines, this would force Iran to come to the negotiation table.
The P5+1 continued its carrot and stick formula of incentives and sanctions for years to come.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
U.S. President Barack Obama was elected in 2008, promising a fresh approach to seemingly intractable foreign policy issues. Yet the same pattern prevailed. The UN made repeated attempts to curtail Iran through incentives and sanctions, while intelligence reports revealed more covert nuclear operations by Tehran. Iran was developing a second highly classified uranium enrichment facility outside the holy city of Qom.
Clearly, it was obvious to the Obama administration that if there was nothing done about it, pretty soon, 5 or 6 years, Iran would have developed a bomb and also the ability to deliver.
To understand why President Obama's approach, I think, was seen as refreshing, you have to understand what came before it. President George W. Bush's approach to nonproliferation was regime change. We invaded Iraq on the false premise that they had weapons of mass destruction and programs that were gearing up to build nuclear weapons, even though the intelligence showed clearly that it didn't. President Obama came in and said, you don't get rid of nonproliferation problems by invading these countries.
The president understood that his best chance of ensuring that Iran would not obtain a nuclear weapon was to have a negotiation.
In 2013, Iran elected a new president, Hassan Rouhani, a supporter of nuclear negotiations. In September 2013, President Obama placed a call to President Rouhani, marking the first high-level contact between the U.S. and Iran since 1979.
Hassan Rouhani's election reflected the fact that the Iranian public really wanted a nuclear deal. They really wanted to end sanctions, and they felt that this was the moment to do it.
Secretary of State John Kerry began offering a new vision for future talks.
When he was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, John Kerry got entrees from the Sultan of Oman to say the Iranians wanted to open up a channel. And so he made trips to Oman to see whether there was any reality in that, spoke with Secretary Clinton and with President Obama, who ultimately decided to test out whether a secret channel would in fact bilaterally begin to get some traction.
By the end of the year, Iran had signed an interim agreement, the Joint Plan of Action, with the P5+1 and the IAEA. The agreement put limits on Iran's nuclear program while partially lifting sanctions and unfreezing Iranian assets. Momentum towards crafting a comprehensive nuclear agreement began to grow, with ongoing talks taking place in Geneva and Vienna.
The Iran deal was a rare modern example of old-school diplomacy in action. It was fraught, and many of the American public servants who worked on it came away with literal broken bones. Wendy Sherman busted her nose and her pinky. John Kerry broke a femur. There were screaming matches so loud that at the Palais Coburg in Vienna, someone finally had to come in and say, all the guests can hear you. This was high-stakes, high-drama diplomacy.
But the effort to strike a deal with Iran was met with political resistance in the U.S. In 2015, U.S. Senator Tom Cotton and 46 other senators signed a letter to Iran warning that any nuclear agreement reached without congressional approval would be reversed by a Republican president.
My reaction to the letter was utter disbelief. During my 29 years here in the Senate, I never heard of, nor even heard of it being proposed, anything comparable to this.
The problem we've got here is we have a real disagreement over the talk regarding this treaty. And let there be no mistake, this is a treaty that is being negotiated.
It was a bad, bad deal. The people who were negotiating it we argued with them and argued with them about what they were doing, how they were doing it. They roundly rejected anything that we offered. They were dismissive.
I beat a path from the White House at the time I was working for Vice President Joe Biden up to the Hill, up Pennsylvania Avenue, along with many of my colleagues in the administration on a very regular basis. We sat with senior leaders in the Congress, the chair and ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, for example. We sat with the senators and members of the House in closed session in all members' briefings for hours on end. And we brought not just diplomats, but our intelligence professionals as well to talk about Iranian capabilities and intentions.
Imagine if the United States House of Representatives, if we marched down there in unison this afternoon, shouting death to Iran, death to, it's almost unthinkable. And yet that's a pretty common occurrence in Iran. And we're supposed to lay down trust in the hands of people who will say things like that.
After months of intense negotiations, in July 2015, a deal was finally reached. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which would become better known as the Iran nuclear deal. Iran agreed to severely limit its ability to produce weapons-grade uranium or plutonium, in part by not building any heavy water reactors for 15 years. The IAEA would be permitted to visit nuclear sites or places alleged to have covert nuclear activity, as well as to monitor all points in the nuclear supply chain. Iran also agreed to reduce its stockpile of uranium by 98%.
The deal significantly restricted their ability to produce and deploy uranium centrifuges, which are a critical piece of the nuclear fuel cycle in order to enrich uranium for a nuclear warhead. In addition, the deal granted much more access for the International Atomic Energy Agency into Iran.
It's rife with holes, but the biggest hole is there's no way to verify and there's no way to inspect. For reasons that I'm not exactly sure, the Obama administration elected to agree to the no access to military bases in terms of inspections of their nuclear program. Just that one thing alone is the old loophole that you could drive a Mack truck through. It's just so big that it makes it unenforceable.
There is enormous, the most intrusive, expansive monitoring verification anywhere in the world, with quite difficult interventions by the International Atomic Energy Agency that have been agreed to. So with some of those inspections and those specific specifications going on for 20 years and 25 years, and then forever, Iran is not allowed to have a nuclear weapon.
Let's face it, since 1979, Iran has been an enemy of the United States. I don't see how it benefits U.S. foreign policy to give Iran more of a free hand in the region.
The region is safer. Germany and the United States are safer. Europe is safer. Israel is safer. And the world is safer because Iran's pathways to a nuclear weapon were blocked, and might I add, with Iran's consent.
It was a mistake to not include Iran's regional posture in the discussion on the nuclear issue. Of course, that was excluded deliberately because Iran insisted on limiting the discussions to the nuclear issue.
In 2016, Donald Trump was elected President of the United States. He had come to power promising to repeal what he called the bad deals made by the Obama administration, the Iran nuclear deal chief among them.
I announced last October that the Iran deal must either be renegotiated or terminated. I made clear that if the deal could not be fixed, the United States would no longer be a party to the agreement.
The criticism of any diplomatic outcome, any negotiation, can be, why didn't you get more? And those of us who are actively engaged in the negotiation will say, we got everything we could. And who's right and who's wrong there? That's a very hard thing to figure out.
Iran had been abiding by the agreement under the close watch of the IAEA.
Indeed, the International Atomic Energy Agency had issued 11 compliance reports and had said in every single one that Iran had complied fully.
Sure, it wasn't building nuclear weapons, but it was pretty aggressively intervening as far afield as Yemen. And I think that created an atmosphere in the region that was conducive to the Trump administration's essentially pulling out of the deal.
Most experts and countries other than the US and President Trump would say that that agreement had worked, was working, in terms of setting way back Iran's nuclear program and preventing them from acquiring a nuclear weapon.
Congress began drafting legislation to put new sanctions on Iran, this time for its ballistic missile program, support of terrorism, and human rights violations. In 2018, President Trump officially withdrew from the Iran deal, to the dismay of much of the international community.
We still believe that with the deal, we would have had a better foundation to talk with Iran about further deals than we do now, after a deal was prematurely broken off that was unanimously agreed on and introduced by the UN Security Council.
President Trump instead promised to come up with a new deal.
Certainly, in my view, the deal had been far more beneficial to Iran than it had been to anybody else, and it ran a meaningful risk of destabilizing the region. So I favor the Trump administration's decision to withdraw.
That deal did not permanently end the Iranian nuclear program, which was probably an unachievable objective, given the advancement of the technology and the fact that Iran is a sophisticated country and had already essentially mastered the basic technical means to achieve a nuclear weapon. What it did do was it bought a significant amount of time. It removed from Iran's possession many of the technologies, centrifuges, enriched uranium, a plutonium reactor, that it could use to advance toward a nuclear weapon.
Ironically, by moving out of the nuclear deal, it is the United States that is isolated, not Iran. Iran has the sympathy and support of Europeans, Russians, Chinese, and a lot of other countries around the world who are committed to what a treaty means, what a deal means.
President Trump, of course, has taken a bold new direction, let's say. Where is that going to go? I'm not sure. Because of my experience in Iraq and Lebanon, I'm very, very careful about anything that sounds like US-backed regime change. Normally doesn't work too well for the party that pursues it.
Britain, France, Germany, and Iran said they would still adhere to the terms of the agreement.
There will be some impact on Iran because companies in Europe and Japan and elsewhere will fear potential sanctions from the United States, and so probably will withdraw and reduce economic activity in Iran. But without that broader global commitment to squeezing Iran, I don't think the impact will be as severe as it was before.
If we have to go back and we withdraw from the nuclear deal, we certainly do not go back to where we were before. We will be standing on a much, much higher position.
This is a real threat to our security. When you eliminate the diplomatic tools, when you overutilize sanctions, as we're at risk of doing by sanctioning our European allies for not withdrawing from the Iran agreement when the Iranians were complying, we eliminate the means of avoiding conflict.
The Europeans have tried to put some processes in place, including blocking legislation and different methods of financing to try to continue to have that kind of investment. Whether they will be able to hold on to that or not, we don't know the end of this story yet.
There is an Iranian proverb which states that a stone thrown at the right time is better than gold given at the wrong time. It remains to be seen whether the timing of America's newest round of sanctions and isolation will create positive change in Tehran.
Great Decisions is America's largest discussion program on global affairs. Discussion groups meet in community centers, libraries, places of worship, and homes across the country to discuss global issues with their community. Participants read the 8-topic briefing book, meet to discuss each topic, and complete a ballot, which shares their views with Congress. To start or join a discussion group in your community, visit greatdecisions.org or call 1-800-477-5836. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.